Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us this week from Washington, D.C., Elise Labott, who's the founder of Zivvy Media. Elise, great to see you. Wonderful to have you.
Great to be with you, Ivo.
From New York City, Ryan Heath, senior editor at Politico and author of and podcast host of Global Insider. Ryan, great to have you back as well. And from London, Gideon Rachman, chief foreign affairs columnist for the Financial Times and host of the Rachman Review. Gideon, wonderful to have you here as well. We all have multiple hats these days, don't we? What I want to talk about, a lot of things to talk about. Biden's first year in foreign policy. How do we grade him? I don't think we necessarily do grades. That's for other people. But let's analyze where we are today. Got to talk about the crisis with Russia and Ukraine, which continues to dominate the headlines in one form or another. And then a lot of things happening in Europe, in France and Germany, of course, in Britain, Partygate and what have you. So really want to get into that as well. But let's start off, Ryan, with you on Biden's first year. You and your colleagues took an interesting dive into talking to ambassadors in Washington and sort of said, okay, how does the first year go and how does it compare? Perhaps take off with that story, but then sort of give us your sense of how Biden is doing when it comes to foreign policy.
Yep. I think there's actually a couple of other interesting data points that get it beyond the sort of anecdote data that we were getting from these diplomats that I've been very surprised by. So the backdrop to all of it is Biden's approval rating has been sinking for 5 months now. August 30 was the last time he was in positive territory there. He basically gets identical ratings to Trump, whether it's a grading system, whether it's approval versus disapproval. And so while he gives himself pretty high marks, like he did in this press conference this week, when you throw it to the voters, or obviously when you throw it to Mitch McConnell, and as we did, we threw it to the diplomats, it becomes a much more mixed picture. So what we did with this story with the diplomats is we spoke to 19 ambassadors or deputy ambassadors in DC. And, bear in mind, anyone in the administration at a senior level is going to have more requests than they have time in their diary. Ambassadors, prime ministers, and presidents obviously want face time with the new administration. So someone is always going to be disappointed. That's my sort of asterisk on all of this. But when you dig into the complaints, if you're from a large country, basically it's okay. They say you get good access. They like the direction of travel of most of the policies. Things are okay if you're in the G7, essentially. But if you're from Africa, for example, or you're from a medium or small country, you're not really getting good access and you're starting to get very annoyed. And people use pretty colorful language to describe those problems to us. So we had African officials talking about how they really can't get any meetings with the president. They're dealing with lower level staff. They think Biden's finally meeting his COVID pledges, but we're extremely frustrated at being shut out of vaccine markets. They don't want charity. They just want to be able to buy the vaccines, and they still can't do that. When it comes to Europe, there's a real hope that the Ukraine crisis is going to prove a bit of a turning point here, but the administration has a very ingrained tendency to want to deal with countries in groups rather than do the complicated, time-consuming schmoozing and listening that it might take to generate really lasting goodwill. And you see that with the Baltics feeling like they're left out of the discussion when it comes to Ukraine. And you see others, even countries as big as Spain, waiting until August of last year to even get a phone call with Biden. So there's a real set of complaints there that will only really be fixed with some investment of time. And at the end of the day, the administration is going to have to find a way to move out of COVID mode. They're going to have to start doing the presentation of credentials of new ambassadors in person. They're going to have to let someone have a meal with Biden at some point in the future. And until that happens, there's going to be this niggling that we reported in this story.
At least sort of take the data that you have, which is really, in some ways any administration, any time will have, there's never enough time in the day to fill the demands of everyone. And, I remember I used to run years ago a small program on learning about American foreign policy, and we got diplomats and others from all over the country, all over the world, and they had to do a project, and they would do, they're going to do a project on the U.S. relationship with Cameroon. And I said, well, U.S. might be really important in Cameroon, but the Cameroon's not really important to the United States. So good luck with that. Compared to the other thing, but it says something more, right? It says it's not only about that. It's about how, if you're back, right? America's back. How can you be back when the kind of relationship that is normal that exists in Washington and in allied capitals, or partner capitals or non-partner capitals, isn't as normal as it used to be?
Okay, well, a couple of things. And first of all, I'll just say, you remember as a NATO ambassador, Ivo, it was sometimes hard to get a meeting with you. So, some of this is like kind of
for the press, particularly for the press, But I mean, some of this is just indigenous to, there's a shortage of time. There's a certain amount of priorities. I thought Ryan's piece was terrific. I was like mesmerized by it. Of course, for policy wonks like us, like all that color and such was really terrific. But and I've heard stories about bigger countries that, like, certain ambassadors that should be getting and meeting with Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, for instance, are kind of relegated to the deputy. But, that's about FaceTime, and that's important. But I think countries are also concerned about the direction of the policy. Now, as Ryan said, excuse me, I have a little bit of cold, so I'm a little stuffed up today. But as Ryan said, a lot of Europeans are hoping this close consultation on Ukraine will, show that the U.S. really is engaged. But I think if you look on Biden's foreign policy as a whole, this kind of nationalist America first tendency is still in there. And that's really, reflective in some of the policies and some of the strategic errors that they've had this year. So you saw the withdraw, they want to focus on this foreign policy for the middle class, how domestic and foreign policy are related. They want to focus on this strategic competition with China. So they're pulling out of Afghanistan. That was, not planned very well. That was, I think by and large, one of the real ugly aspects of last year. And then you had the deal with the AUKUS deal with Australia that kept out the French. Now, you could say that was a good deal, but it was also about, countering China, not thinking about the big picture of your allies. And so these strategic errors are showing that, and I think by and large, people think, Biden's foreign policy, while it might be warm and fuzzier in tone, is not all that much different than Trump's kind of America first policy. So he's back, Blinken is back, he's traveling, it's all glad handing and pats on the back. But I think on the policy, COVID would be another one where at first Biden was like really stingy with those vaccines for Americans first. So, these two aspects, these two America first and America's backer, have kind of rubbed up against each other over the past year. And I think as we see the year ahead and the challenges, maybe these crises like Ukraine, or we were talking about the crisis in Yemen earlier, where that's still unresolved. Is there going to be more engagement with the Gulf allies who also feel a little bit left out? That's what we're going to be looking to see for the next year. Yeah, interesting, Elise. I think that's right. Certainly going forward, but also looking back, and Gideon sitting in London. Richard Haas, of course, wrote the piece in Foreign Affairs about the change, as Elise said, between Trump and
I wrote it first, but that's fine.
All right. So as Elise wrote first, and then Richard Haas stole it. Anyway, this argument about America first, you hear that in Europe a lot, right? And so how do you look at that?
I have less sympathy for it. I mean, I think in very broad terms, it's obviously true that America's been turning inwards for some time. I mean, it was Obama who talked about nation building at home, after all. And, Trump was a kind of more extreme, less genteel version of that. But, when ambassadors say, oh, we're not getting, in to see the president or whatever, it long ago concluded that although in some ways it'd be really cool to be an ambassador. You've got a great house, a nice car. It's actually a horrible job because it's like a recipe for grotesque social anxiety. It's like being a sort of unpopular teenager. They spend their whole time worrying about, who's invited them. That's what the job's about. And inevitably, a lot of people are disappointed, particularly when you have a very old president, COVID-19, and, quite a lot going on. And, when African countries, in some respects I sympathize, but was it really better under Trump? I mean, this was a president, you remember how he referred to African countries. So, and
European countries.
Yeah, but particularly the African countries. I mean, he was contemptuous, openly contemptuous. And so, look, I mean, I'm sure there are things they could have done better, but I would focus more on, if there's disillusionment, it's with the substance of policy, and not so much that people feel that Biden is a bad guy or that he doesn't necessarily have the right instincts, which I think was the fear with Trump. I mean, I remember before the election sitting, say, in Berlin, and fairly senior Germans really anxious about what a second Trump presidency would mean. And they said that, one of them said, he could take Europe apart faster than we could build it. They felt he was actively hostile. They don't think that about Trump. About Biden, but I think they do think that Biden has made mistakes, and above all, Afghanistan. That I think, I don't think it's a coincidence that the turning point in the polls is August. That is this debacle, which even if Americans wanted to get out of Afghanistan, they didn't want to get out that way. And similarly, I think a lot of Europeans looked at it and they said, "Yeah, America's back, really." And in the UK, there was a very bitter debate in the House of Commons. I think people perhaps, didn't look enough at the European lack of capacity and why are we so completely dependent on America. And that was partly actually maybe the sense of humiliation in Europe was a realization of how, once America says it's over, we just all have to pack up and go. But that moment, I think, was a bit of a turning point in the sense that, we're not sure either that we're confident in the competence of these guys, or that ultimately in the end it isn't just a prettier version of America first.
Ryan, I think that I think both Gideon and Elise sort of have a really important point about both the competence, but also to sort of, in some ways, the expectation post-Trump was extraordinarily high, that for some reason, everything would be able, here's a competent team. They know how to do this. They've done it, and they can just run the world once again. And, that was also a little bit unrealistic. And I think Gideon's point about the Afghanistan showing the incompetence of the Europeans as part of that, isn't that part, if you were having to defend the administration, I'm not asking you to do so, but the reality is expectations were impossible to meet. Given after everything that Trump had done. How should we think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different to the impossible expectations that were on Obama, which was really a kind of a cult-like adulation of the man. But this time around, I think where some of the kind of like dissonance or the expectation gap sets in is Biden has just been known for so long as this backslapping, schmoozing sort of president, but stick him in a COVID environment or around this set of senior advisors and officials, and that side of Biden doesn't really come out so much. Maybe it does when he makes gaffes around Ukraine and minor incursions, for example. But all of those good sides of Biden that create goodwill and give people that sort of instinctive warmth around him, he's not able to make those connections in these kind of COVID restrictions that the administration has set for itself. Another thought that really resonated with me is this sense that when people are talking to that next layer of officials or the next two layers of officials, some of them feel like they're being talked at, like it's not a dialogue, they're sort of being spoken to. And I think that robs some people the wrong way as well. And then another thought that really stuck out for me was from the EU ambassador, Stavros Lambrinidis. And he said, when you put skin in the game, they listen. And this is the learning point and the action point for allies or, sort of transactional partners of the US, is like, if all you're going to do is sit there and whine and want a photo op, then we're not going to show up for you. We're not going to make the time for you. But you start putting something on the table, and more of us will turn up at the table. And I think that is a very reasonable position for the administration to take.
Elise, I want to go to you both on this point, but then sort of let's transition to the next issue of Russia, Ukraine, because you have a sense that the administration, if they hadn't learned before, certainly learned by after AUKUS that you mentioned, after Afghanistan, that engaging allies really is important if you want to try to get a common position. And you've seen a lot of travel, a lot of phone calls, a lot of engagement of all kinds to get a unified policy on Ukraine. How would you, to what extent are we seeing a learning process that is now playing out in a positive way when it comes to engaging allies on the big issues of the day?
So, picking up on what Ryan said, like that is all true on kind of the, not the optics, but the FaceTime of it. I think what allies are really concerned about is the strategy. And so when Ryan says, they feel like they're being talked at with talking points without a strategy. What is their strategy for the Middle East and all of these shifting sands with the Abraham Accords and, trying to get the Palestinian situation? Biden said in the beginning, he wanted to emphasize human rights on the Palestinian situation. Lebanon is a disaster. Yemen is a disaster. What are the strategies for these countries? And when you talk about allies, Ivo, allies could have a strategy. They could be brought in. What are your thoughts? As Ryan said, it's always talking at you. This is what we think. Get on board now. But the problem is they're just talking about, kind of more what Les Gelb used to say, positioning without taking a position. And so that's, I think, part of the concern. Now, I think moving over to Ukraine, there is a hope that, obviously there's a lot more consideration as to how there could be a coordinated strategy with Europe in particular on Russia and Ukraine. And so you see, a lot of consultation by Tony Blinken, obviously went to Ukraine and is meeting with Lavrov today, and we can talk a lot more about that. But you see them coordinating with the allies because they know US sanctions on Russia alone for invading Ukraine wouldn't be as effective as the European sanctions, where that's where a lot of Russian business is being done. So, I mean, if you look at what's happening right now, Tony Blinken is coordinating with those allies. It's really just a question of whether, Russia really wants assurances from the United States for the rest of Europe. He's asking for, a moratorium on countries entering NATO, and in particularly Ukraine, or taking out troops. Obviously, some of that is a non-starter. But if you saw what happened in Geneva today, when Tony Blinken said, we are going to answer in writing these Russian, concerns that were proposed in that draft treaty about Russia's security vis-a-vis NATO. That's going to take a lot of consultation with the NATO allies, particularly since the US is not a European country, and a lot of those borders, the US may have troops there, but these are European countries who border with Russia.
Gideon, where do you think we are today? So we had a week of diplomacy last week that didn't seem to really address the fundamental issues that the Russians wanted, or indeed the United States wanted. The president on Wednesday saying that war was now, was going to happen in all likelihood. And then, of course, the meeting that Elise just referred to between Tony Blinken and Sergei Lavrov in Geneva, which seemed to at least keep a diplomatic door open, so that it wasn't really closed. If what's your assessment of where we are? What's the likelihood of confrontation versus some form of diplomatic denouement on where we are? How would you look at it?
I think that as far as I can get, the feeling in London and Washington is that war is more 65, 30 meeting. Now, I was interested that, Elise's reference to Blinken saying, oh, we'll give you written responses. Because one of the things the Russians said beforehand is, we're not going to let you spin this out. That seems to me to be a classic way of spinning it out, saying, we're just we got to consult, and then we got to revise, we got to draft. And if they can get away with it, great, but there is this sense that the Russians are closer and closer to being ready to move, and that they will move. The only thing I'd say is that I quite carefully said London and Washington, there's this consensus that the war's imminent. I was reading what's felt like a pretty well-sourced piece in Le Monde about the French attitude. And they were saying, quoting French officials saying, we can see the same build-up, but we're not as convinced that war is around the corner. And, unless the British and Americans have seen something they're not showing us, we don't see it. So, in a way, that's rather reassuring if it's not as self-evident that conflict is on the way to the French, but certainly, as far as I can tell, the Americans think, yeah, the Russians are going to do it.
Ryan, to Gideon's point, I'm also struck that the Ukrainians don't seem to think that they're on the brink of a major military attack on their country. Zelensky gave a speech, I think it was yesterday, saying, don't, this is slow down here. It's not all the world's not coming to an end just yet. They want, of course, commitments and security guarantees and armaments and all of that. But there is this sense that even Ukraine is not feeling that this is going to be a conventional sort of military attack. And maybe that's what the French are also reflecting. How do you see it as we entered week, whatever it is, of this crisis?
Yeah, well, obviously anything is possible, but some points on the Ukrainian-French side of the ledger, let's say. If invasion really was imminent, would Zelensky be spending as much time worrying about bringing Poroshenko to trial as he is about Putin? I mean, I'd be a bit more worried about my country being invaded if I thought it really was happening tomorrow. I think, it feels to me like these now seemingly endless rounds of diplomatic talks, it's a bit like a hostage negotiation. The longer you keep the hostage taker talking, the greater the chance you have of being able to eventually diffuse the situation. And then obviously you have a series of neighboring countries wanting to help arm Ukraine, and also making sure they themselves are well prepared for any surprise moves from Russia. So if Russia was going to do it, it kind of does need to do it now, because it's going to be harder to do it in the future. But also you see the US not really rushing to make sure those arms are there. So, the fact that they still think they have room to maneuver, to not push Putin to jump because it might be his only chance to jump. All of that says, there might be a way out of this. So I think those are the right moves. But what I do think is that there actually isn't real unity in NATO on all of these gray areas of exactly what the economic consequences should be. Biden speaking essentially truthfully about the minor incursion issue. Like a gaffe is when someone accidentally tells the truth. America isn't going to invade Russia, if there is a minor incursion. And so there's got to be better alignment on the NATO side about what to do with these digital or hybrid attacks or little sort of sorties into Ukraine territory. And that's not there yet.
Ryan, I think you sort of pinpoint where the debate may be going. And that is, I think it's up to now, it's been very much sort of, there's going to be an invasion, it's going to be major, it's going to, and what do we do in order to deter it or respond to it? And is there a way diplomatically to get it? But what if there's not an invasion? That was never the plan. That in fact it is about destabilizing the government in Ukraine, which is ultimately what Putin is about. That Putin understands that an invasion doesn't get him what he wants. It gets him more NATO nearer the border, et cetera. So, Elise, when we look at the Washington debate, we're not there yet. But and maybe what Biden was reflecting in in a Biden-esque way in the press conference was actually what we were more worried about is something that's not a major invasion. He called it a minor incursion. And then what do we do? And where is NATO going to be? And how is that unity, that much vaunted unity that we have, going to be maintained? Should we be, one, worried about something that's actually different than a major military advance that than, one thinks with 175,000 troops, which is what the intelligence community was thinking. And secondly, should we also be worried about that under those circumstances, the traditional fault lines in NATO will become deeper?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we need to be worried about. That, look, in the span of 5 minutes, Biden went from like an off ramp with Russia saying, listen, I know they care about Ukraine joining NATO, but that's not happening anytime soon. I know they care about Ukrainian nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I'm not putting nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And he was kind of, David Tiger of the New York Times, I think very depthfully said to him, it sounds like you're offering him an off ramp. And, Biden said, oh, I don't know if they'll take it, but there are ways that we can. And this is what I think in this written assurances that they're trying to offer, which, as we've said, that's may not, as Gideon said, that may not be enough for Russia. Lavrov's really taking it as a win today, that like what we got is they're going to address our concerns. And so, maybe there is a way that, we can halt a full-scale invasion. I think what we do need to be worried about, and this is why I think Biden's comments, while, as Ryan said, were true, and I said yesterday, I think Biden's just too honest, because, he just speaks what he feels and, isn't really worried about sending kind of messages to say to Putin, essentially, well, if you make a minor incursion or a little cyber attack, like there's going to be a lot of division in NATO and we don't know what we're going to do. And maybe we could live with that. And that is an invitation for Putin to, keep this diplomacy going, make a little incursion, I call it a mini incursion, not a minor, a mini incursion, and then call it a day and say, okay, I'm ready to talk diplomacy now. So he comes off as the winner. He gets another little piece of Ukraine. And then he waits for like another opportunity to create another crisis. And meanwhile, he's just inching into getting more parts of Ukraine while also seemingly open to diplomacy.
Yeah, Gideon. No, exactly. I think this is something that somehow we're really not talking about this. What's Putin? We've talked about the big Putin strategy, but what are the tactics to implement it? Gideon, how do you see it?
Yeah, but I mean, to be honest, I think that, call me a kind of appeaser, but I think at this stage we'd probably take the scenario that
we would.
that Elise is laying out.
Yes.
Because it's essentially Russia as we've got to know it over the last 12 years. They took a bite of Georgia. The annexation of Crimea was a lot bigger.
Who's
than
talking
that.
about Crimea right now?
But realistically, we don't want a major war in Europe. And
right.
if the Zelensky government survives, etc. And frankly, a minor incursion, as Biden said, there would then be an argument about what sanctions to apply. But there'd be an even worse argument, if there was a major invasion, because once you start talking about cutting off SWIFT, inviting, a Russian retaliation on gas, you're talking about, potentially major damage to European economies. So it's not like that debate would be any easier. Actually, it would be rather harder. Ideally, we will see that Putin is deterred from doing any of this stuff, and that's not impossible. But if it's, a huge buildup, and then actually, not, although, I know Zelensky will get very upset about this, but not this sort of full-scale invasion, I think most people would regard that as a result.
We're living with Crimea, and no one ever, I don't even see that really being talked about in this context. Like, okay, you better not, invade Ukraine and give me back Crimea. We've kind of, Trump like floated that he might officially accept it, and that didn't go anywhere, but we've unofficially accepted.
That's the reality of the world, isn't it? I mean, we lived with Russian occupation of the Baltic states throughout the Cold War, which we didn't accept, and so on. But eventually, these things, in the great scheme of history, if you're lucky, get righted. But it's not going to be righted immediately.
Well, I mean, as part of that, of course, we've also Ryan, the language that we're using is, if one Russian soldier goes across the border, that will be seen as an invasion. Well, last I looked, there are a hell of a lot of Russian soldiers across the border today, and they've been there not only in Crimea, but of course also in the Donbass, eastern Ukraine for the past 8 years. And there is that leverage that maybe we have fallen into this traditional, the only thing we're worried about is a real invasion a la the 1940s.
What will we do about it anyway? I mean, unless someone's planning to put troops on the ground to push those boots back, I mean, it doesn't matter what you call it. Like,
insurgency, we're now talking about to that. It's a complicated issue. We'll be back on it. I hope that none of the Russians were listening to this, because I think you guys put on the table a whole series of things that they could do to make life for the West difficult. I would note, I think that to Gideon's point, just on these written responses, the person drafting that's going to have a hell of a time figuring out how to square that circle. But somebody will draft it accordingly. Apparently, that's what Tony Blinken said. We talked about European division with regard to Russia, which ought to be relatively easy for Europe to have a singular point. But perhaps, Gideon, one of the reasons it is so hard is because Europe seems to be completely and totally distracted, both in terms of some of the major countries in Europe, from Germany to France to, of course, the UK. And then the European Union, we had a really interesting, contretemps, can we say that in good English, with Macron going out and saying that the EU was going to have its own policy towards Russia, but nobody knew that the EU was going to have its own policy. Looking at this, a lot of confusion. Oh, we have a new guest.
Yeah. I think there's exactly mention of NATO.
Like that, right?
Exactly.
No, that's great. How do you see things happening? Of course, starting in your own country, where it's not even clear the leader of the country is going to be around for that long.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I was having breakfast this morning with a kind of Labour Party activist, and they said to me, "Do you think Russia's going to invade Ukraine?" What we were just talking about, and I said, in the next 2 weeks. And I said, "Well, it's quite a strong chance." Yeah, and he said, "Oh, damn." And I said, "You're worried about the Ukrainians?" He said, "Well, that's the one thing that might save Boris Johnson." Because, which gives you a sense both of the introspection of this country. It's domestic politics is what everyone's talking about. Will Boris Johnson survive? And even relatively serious people are seeing Ukraine through that prism. And he is in deep, deep trouble. And there was a rather good interview that Rory Stewart, who I think is now at Yale, gave, where somebody asked him, should we be surprised by what's happened to Boris Johnson, the implosion of his prime ministership? And he said, no, absolutely not. Everything we've known about this man for the last 30 years tells you, like, he's serially dishonest. He always runs into these problems. He was forced out of 2 jobs in sort of civilian life because of dishonesty. He's a kind of accident waiting to happen, and it's happened now. And on the other hand, people, because of that, have a very advanced respect for his ability to survive. A Conservative MP I know who actually hates Johnson said to me, "Oh, he'll get through this. He's like a greased piglet. You get your hands on him, he slips free." And so there is that, but that's the preoccupation here. But obviously that's Britain. But France is in the middle of a presidential election, and I think anything Macron says at the moment has to be seen through that prism. Germany's in a very new and quite fragile phase. Merkel's gone after however long it was, 15, 16 years. We have a new chancellor trying to prove himself and also trying to hold together a coalition government, which actually has a division on Ukraine right through the middle of it, with the Greens kind of tougher minded on this than the SPD. Italy, which has actually had quite a year of kind of sane, stable government, but looks like it's going to revert to another period of instability around the presidency, potential comeback for the 85-year-old Silvio Berlusconi. So, and that's actually happening on Monday. I think they're having a vote on the presidency. So, those are the big European big four, the Quad or the Quint or whatever you want to call them, and they're all in some internal disarray,
making it so much harder, Ryan, for if you are preoccupied domestically. By the way, true for the United States in some ways too. But if you're preoccupied domestically, the capacity of the system to focus on what's happening abroad becomes that much more difficult. So how do you see this playing out, this internal preoccupation, in some cases weakness, for the capacity of Europe to have a consistent and coherent policy on an issue like Russia?
The optimistic view is that Europe has an automatic stabilizer, in a sense, via the European Union, which obviously isn't fully competent to step in and exercise hard power when its biggest powers are amiss. But when the US federal system, when Washington, D.C. is dysfunctional or disorganized, there's no kind of like higher power to step in and provide some stability or to fill in some economic recovery. And it is a little bit different in Europe in that respect. So, I'm sure there are plenty of people in Brussels that would like to think that's what the EU can do, that it can kind of expand like polyfiller into these political vacuums and provide some of that support. Not sure that that's particularly true, but they've obviously set some of that up via their coronavirus efforts. Which, you pull the lens back, that's actually going quite well in terms of actual vaccinations and in terms of actual economic recovery efforts. So there's some merit to that argument there. I don't know, like I would say on Boris, it's really tricky. At the end of the day, he also won 2 elections in a row. So if he's not going to be knifed by his own party, he faces a weak opposition. He's probably not going to be knifed by the civil servant who is doing a report into his parties. It's not her job to knife a sitting prime minister. She can damn him, but she can't throw him out of a job. So I don't know. I feel like it's going to just be more stumbling along. It's not major disaster and it's not major recovery in any of these countries.
A lot of things happening, at least in the sort of the European political circles. I was struck by not only Macron's speech on Russia, where he said in the coming weeks Europe should have a common strategy for how to deal with Russia. Sort of wondering why it's going to take weeks for a policy that a situation has been around for a long time. But what does the absence of the EU on the Russia scene tell you? What is it? This is 70 years after European unification efforts have kind of came off the ground, and yet when it comes to the security of a continent, the most important European organization doesn't seem to have a role in it. What should we take away from that?
Well, I think it shows, divisions within the EU on these policy issues. You have countries like Poland or Hungary that might be looking at it in one way. And then you have, Germany, for instance, that's, wants to preserve the Nord Stream 2 in a different way. So, look, Gideon and Ryan talked about a lot of internal pressures, but I feel like some of these external pressures are really what's dividing them. Gideon's done some great writing on the fact that, the EU, as an institution is still very strong at its core. But when you look at some of the, the rising tide of authoritarianism, what's happening with China, there's certainly not a united position on how to deal with China, because various countries have their own particular interests. And then look at what Macron is doing with this kind of whole idea of European defense. And look what happened with AUKUS. Macron said this is an affront to Europe and this is horrible and this is really a dig at Europe. Some of the other European countries are like, no, it's a dig at France. It's not a dig at Europe. And so I think that the external pressures are where you're going to see, kind of the divisions when it comes to things like COVID, those kind of things. Certainly there's a lot more cohesion, but there's not even a lot of cohesion on dealing with the environment. So I think, while they're grappling with, their kind of internal politics, certainly Russia is presenting the greatest potential for division within the EU, because particularly different countries closer to Russia have different interests.
And look to the United States. They basically don't trust the EU to look after them. And one has to say that, the EU has always aspired to be a power player globally, but I think even most of its most ardent defenders would admit being there. And I thought that there was a rather sort of kind of pathetic moment when there was a letter that the EU's foreign policy chief, Borrell, wrote to European foreign ministers during this crisis, which was leaked, and where he said our main goal should be just to have a seat at the table of the negotiations. Forget the outcome. It was entirely procedural. It was about fates, really, rather than any sort of real policy.
And that letter, by the way, was just quite remarkable, as you mentioned, and it just showed in some sense that on this set of issues, the European Union still has a ways to go to speak not only with a single voice, but speak in and of itself. I want to spend the last couple of minutes that we have, starting with you, Ryan. Sort of, we look back a little bit at Biden's first year. What can, on foreign policy, what do you think we can expect that is different from the first year in the coming year? Of course, an election year in the United States, lots of things happening domestically. But on the foreign policy front, where would you see, if you have to pick one issue, and I'm going to ask all three of you, sort of one issue or one area where that we really haven't thought about or focused on, or one way of doing business that might be a little different in 2022, and we ought to be watching as watchers of news, foreign policy, and world news.
I'll slightly cheat and give you 1.5 because I'm not sure where climate fits. Is it a foreign policy? Is it an economic policy? Right. What is it? But I think a jobs-based climate policy is going to be essential in terms of international coordination and for American economic security in future. And I think they're going to keep trying to marry that up. And we just didn't get there in Glasgow. There's a lot more to be filled in making that happen. And so that I think that will just keep rising up because of the jobs connection. But in terms of what we might think of as traditional foreign policy, I think conflict, flare-ups, hotspots of the Sahel region. And that's where France has been heavily involved. It's a way to help mend that relationship with France. And it can really only be fixed by America and France if everything hits the fan there. And there's a lot of indicators to suggest that it can hit the fan there over the coming 12 months.
We'll watch Sahel, and I agree that the climate issue is a continuation, and hopefully some progress on that. Elise, what you're looking at?
I'm looking at a couple of things. First of all, I'm looking at what is going to happen with the Iran deal. Do they want a deal? Do they not want a deal? How is that going to affect how they deal with the rest of the Gulf states? This is really an open question. And how does the U.S., if it says it wants to pivot to China, how is it going to, or to Asia, how is it going to kind of use what's happening, again, the Abraham Accords and Israel's relations with some of these Gulf states to maybe like let them be more of the caretakers of the region as they've expected. And then I'm also looking at trade. If the US says again that it wants to spend more focus on Asia and strategic competition with China, I think the Asian countries are like, yeah, we like this new outreach, but like, what is, again, the strategy? I've been really kind of amazed that President Biden, with all of his years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and fashioning himself as a foreign policy, and the team, the really strong team that he has not really been able to lay out a real strategy for how they're going to deal with Asia, especially since that's the cornerstone of their policy.
Right. No, very apt. Hope both of them become true too. Gideon, what are you looking at? What do you think may be a change?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's not so much a change as we're going to see. I mean, I think Biden's picked the right theme for his sort of foreign policy and his presidency, which is the division between authoritarianism and democracy and trying to promote democracy. But there's all sorts of tensions within that broad outline, which I think we're going to see play out even more in the next year. So a sort of aggressive, outward-looking foreign policy, looking at Russia and China in particular, kinds of issues we've been talking about now. America sort of confronting them around the world. But it might say, if you say actually the real front that matters is domestic, it might point actually to a more constrained American foreign policy, this foreign policy for the middle class, and saying, well, we cannot overcommit because, in fact, the most important fight for democracy is domestic. And then there's the question about what you do about countries that you need as a part of a coalition to push back against the big authoritarian powers who themselves are troubled by small but kind of significant case, which now seems to be, very important to the Republicans. Orban was, fated by Trump and so on. But India's a very interesting case as well. What do you do about them? I mean, I was struck when I was last in Washington speaking to some of the people around Biden that one of them spontaneously mentioned concerns about democracy in India. And I said, I was a bit surprised you're raising it. I mean, obviously that's correct to worry about that, but I thought there'd be such an important ally, you wouldn't want to look at it. And he said, well, in my experience, if you ignore things like that, eventually you get a nasty shock. So they're thinking about it, but they're not clear about what to do about it. So I think that, as I said, they've got the right theme, but even a genius would struggle to reconcile all the different tensions that are inherent in it, and those are going to continue to play out.
So what we're looking at is, will we have a coherent strategy and implementation on democracy versus autocracy, the future of the Gulf with or without an Iranian agreement, trade as an issue, particularly in Asia, the Sahel as areas to look at, and of course, climate, which will be with us. We'll be back next week and the weeks ahead to talking about these and other issues. In the meantime, I want to thank Ryan Heath, Elise Labott, and Gideon Rachman for their contributions today. It was great having you on. And for all of you watching, please continue to do so every Friday on our YouTube channel at the Chicago Council, and hope to see you again next week. And until then, have a very good weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ivo. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.